Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing on public policy evaluation. Okay, so the broad outline that we have framed for discussing the policy evaluation is what is the concept of evaluation, right? And in policy, what exactly is to be evaluated, whether it is the process, criteria, or anything else. Okay, then we'll be discussing some of the major concepts that are associated in policy evaluation or program evaluation, like your treatment effect, confounding effects, evaluation strategies. So all these would be discussing. Then we'll be discussing the major methods that we are using for policy evaluation, that we'll be discussing. And then after that we'll be discussing that what governments usually do for program evaluation or policy evaluation, and what governments can do, whether they have some specific methods or what are the robust methods and what are the general practice that the governments usually do. So all these will be discussing. Then we'll be discussing what are the problems that we may encounter in policy evaluation. So given this brief outline of the entire week, we can now move to discuss that what is the outline for today's discussion. So in today's discussion, we'll be putting emphasis on the concept of policy evaluation, what needs to be evaluated or what is to be evaluated, what is the role of policy evaluation, then what exactly we are evaluating, right? Whether we are measuring impact or we are measuring output. Then we also discuss the dimensions of policy impacts. So given these broad frameworks, now we'll be discussing what is the policy evaluation. Okay, so if you understand the policy cycle, right, that is decision policy making cycle, then we can find that the policy making cycle starts with the identification of issue and agenda setting. Okay, then we have definite stages of policy cycle. So if you see these policy cycles, then the final phase of this policy cycle process is this policy evaluation. Okay, so in policy evaluation, we are giving emphasis on the estimation part, appraisal part of a policy, and what is its content and implementation, and also the goal attainment and other kinds of effects that may be occurring during this policy implementations. Okay, so basically the objective of this policy evaluation is to gathered information, whether and to what extent a policy has actually achieved its targets, and whether it has some other effects like intended effects or unintended effects that needs to be taken care of through this policy evaluation. Okay, and moreover, this policy evaluation also seek to identify what are the factors that can contribute for the success of a policy or a failure of a policy. So we can say that in doing so, the policy evaluation may also lead to recirculating or reforming of the policy processes, because once we are done with evaluation, we the policymakers would be in a position to take a decision that whether to continue that policy or program, whether there needs a change or modification, whether there is something needs to be strengthened, or altogether the policy needs to be terminated. So all these decisions can be taken through the policy evaluation. Okay, so coming to the question that what is to be evaluated, so I have already discussed in policy monitoring that many times monitoring and evaluations are taken together, right, or used together, but the focus of monitoring is quite different from the focus of evaluation. So what is the major focus of the monitoring? It is activities or inputs and outputs, right? But coming to understand the evaluation part, policy evaluation part, the major part that we need to evaluate is the outcomes of the said policy and the impacts of the said policy. So we have already discussed what is the difference between the outcomes and impacts. So outcomes are the medium term consequences, right, and the impacts are the long term consequences. So both needs to be measured through these evaluation processes. Okay, so given this understanding of this policy evaluation, now we can discuss about that what is the role of policy evaluation. Okay, so the major role of policy evaluation may be in terms of creating information or gathering information, those are to be very reliable, so that the policy performances can be evaluated or policy performances can be furthered. And the main objective of policy evaluation is to measure the impact of policies on the society. different kind of policies that we may take into account. Okay, so through this policy evaluation also we can reveal the extent to which the particular goals have been achieved and what are the unattended goals, or what are the gaps between the targeted goal that was put forth and the actual achievement. Okay, and through evaluation also we can understand the degree to which the policy issues have been resolved and what are the unfinished tasks. Okay, so by doing this policy evaluation, it also helps the policymaker to clarify the different values that underline the selection of policy goals and policy objectives. Okay, and moreover, when we do this policy evaluation, it may also result in our efforts to restructure the policy problems, and sometimes it may contribute to the emergence of altogether new objectives or some alternative solutions, and thereby it shows whether the previous adopted policy alternative should be replaced or abandoned, or any kind of changes are to be taken into account. Okay, and moreover, when we accomplish the task of policy evaluation, it ensures effectiveness. That means whether the policy is working or not, to what extent the policy is working. And coming to understand that through this policy evaluation, efficiency is also taken care of. That means it ensures that the policy should not policy is not wasteful. So these two things are also taken care, or these two criteria are also taken care of through policy evaluation. So some of the other values that are also taken care of through policy evaluations are the concept of equity, fairness and democratic issue. Okay, so all these values that we have already discussed in our previous classes, right? So what are the values that are required for policy, for public policy? So all these values can also be ensured through this policy evaluation. And many times we find that these values that we are discussing, they often contradict, right? So that is the reason we are finding there could be a trade-off relationship between policies. Okay, so in the previous classes we also discussed about the synergistic relationship and the trade-off relationship among the policies. So here many times, that is the reason we can identify that many times the values may conflict. Okay, so for example, if you are taking into account these affirmative actions, okay, any affirmative action, then of course it is going to increase the equality, right? And if you assume that it is effective, okay, so if you are taking the affirmative action, then it increases the equality, and assuming that it is effective, but the question is whether it is fair or not, right? So that means this effectiveness and fairness can also conflict each other. Okay, so given this understanding about the policy evaluation, now we can move to discuss about that what exactly we are measuring, that, right? So whether we are measuring the output or impact. So we are measuring impact, not output. That is to be discussed here. So if you see the impact and output, so policy outputs are something which is numbered, which is easily quantified, right? And which occurs immediately as soon as the policy gets implemented. Okay, so policy outputs are the things actually done by the agencies that are given this task of policy implementation. Okay, so that means when policy decisions are made, policy statements are made, see the agencies are given the task for implementation, and once the policy implementation happens, then we are finding the policy outputs in terms of number, right? So outputs usually can be easily counted, easily summed, right? And statistically it can also be analyzed. So for example, we can take this case. The concept of output focuses attention on the matters like what is the more amount of taxes collected after the implementation of GST in India, right? Or we can take the example of that how many miles of highways built under this Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, right? Or we can say that what is the welfare benefits that is paid, right? Or we can think about that what is the amount of traffic fines collected after the implementation of the stringent traffic rules, right? So all these are some of the examples that speaks about some number which are easily counted, easily observed, and can also be statistically analyzed. Okay, so the agencies, those who are given this responsibility of implementing a particular program or policy, so they are under pressure from different stakeholders, right? Or you can say the hierarchy of decision makers. Okay, so the agencies which are under pressure from the hierarchy of authorities like legislatures, or you can think about interest groups and others, they also demonstrate, they try to demonstrate results. So for them the major focus is output, not impact. Okay, so because they have to just showcase after the implementation what is the consequences. Okay, so if they want to highlight, right, so they would be focusing on outputs, not outcomes, just to generate some kind of statistics, and that would be creating a kind of illusion of progress. These are not strictly the progress or achievement through the policies. Okay, so it creates illusion, right? On the other hand, if you see these policy outcomes, so as I told you that these are the medium term consequences, right? So these are the consequences for the society which happens in the medium term, and sometimes these policy outcomes are intended, sometimes they are unintended. Okay, and this policy outcomes stem from the governmental action or even governmental inaction as well. Okay, so for example we can take the case that just to differentiate policy outcomes and policy output is, does program Z increase personal security and contentment? So that means we are trying to understand what is the impact policy Z on personal security and contentment. Okay, so again, since our discussion is policy evaluation, right, and here we highlighted that we are evaluating not the outputs but policy outcomes which occurs in the medium term, and also the impacts, that is the final consequences of a policy to the society or to the targeted groups for which the policies are implemented. Okay, so for that we need to understand that what is this impact evaluation. Okay, and conventionally we can find that policymakers used to focus on inputs and outputs, because just to create an illusion of progress of the policies. Okay, and this impact evaluation shifts this focus from this inputs outputs to outcomes. Okay, and then what is the target of shifting the emphasis, right, of inputs and outputs that we generally monitored, right, and captured what is the input and what is the output in a particular policy. So this conventional emphasis shifted from this input and output to the outcomes, right? The target is to determine if the programs or policies are actually achieving the the intended target, the target that has already been put forth before the implementation of the policies or program. Okay, so this is something we can say that this is a layman's understanding of policy evaluation, that if the policy target is understood, right, and the policy, through this impact evaluation we are trying to understand what are the consequences of this said policy, to what extent the targets have been accomplished or the targets have been achieved. Okay, so given this understanding we can also formally define what is this impact evaluation, right? So we are taking the definition from GLUE and Todd in their report 2022, that this policy impact evaluation is a study that attempts to measure the causal impact or causal relationship of a particular project or program or a policy on the outcome of the interest to the government and other interested parties. So that becomes the policy evaluation. So basically through policy evaluation we are trying to measure the relationship, which relationship, the causal impact of the project or the policy or program on the outcome variable or outcome of the interest of the government and other interested parties. Okay, so specifically we can say that this policy evaluation is a type of evaluation that tries to answer the question like, what is the impact of a particular program or a policy on the outcome of the government interest or interest of some governing bodies or the interested parties. Okay. So, when we try to answer this question, that what is the impact, that means it is the causal impact. It is not just the correlation, it is the causal impact, cause and effect relationship of a policy or a program on the outcome variable or outcome of interest. Okay. And moreover, through this policy impact evaluation, we try to focus on the attribution. So what is this attribution? That means the changes directly caused by the intervention in terms of this policy or program rather than some external factors. Okay. So again, we can discuss about broadly two types of evaluations. The first one is the prospective evaluation and the second one is retrospective evaluation. So we have already discussed in previous classes what is prospective and what is retrospective public policy. So we discussed what is prospective public policy and what is retrospective public policy. So here we will be discussing the evaluation. Prospective evaluation, that means prospective policy is something that the before the implementation or finalization of a policy, right, what is the expected outcome that needs to be identified. Okay. So it is ex ante of the policy implementation. Okay. So the prospective evaluation are also are trying to capture that what is the expected outcomes, right, and based on the expected outcomes we do evaluate, okay, those expected outcomes. So the prospective evaluation are designed during the program planning, and they are built into the implementation stage, and it also allows for the collection of the baseline data for the before the intervention in terms of policies or programs. Okay. And coming to the second type of evaluation, that is retrospective, as the name suggests. So it happens, or evaluation happens after the implementation of a said policy or program. So the retrospective evaluation are conducted once a particular program or policy gets implemented, right, and it must find treatment and comparison group that is that should be in ex post. So this is ex post analysis or ex post evaluation. Okay. And given this understanding of the policy types, policy evaluation types, now we can also discuss about the impact evaluation, right, and that is going to be most effective when the impact evaluation is used along with some other methods. Okay. So impact evaluation is one of the methods, but it is going to be most effective when it is used alongside the other methods. Okay. So what are the other methods that we can think about, so that this evaluation would be most effective if all these methods, right, all these methods are used? So the first is in terms of monitoring. So what is monitoring? We have already taken a specific module on this monitoring. So basically, just to brief about that, monitoring tracks the implementation. Okay. We have also highlighted what are the variables that are taken care during the monitoring stage. So basically it tracks the inputs and outputs, ensuring that the policy or program is being delivered as per the target or as intended. Okay. So this monitoring should be there, right, along with the impact evaluation. Apart from monitoring, the other methods or other things that must also occur along with the impact evaluation is ex ante simulations. So here we take into account the existing data, right, to model the expected effects of different programs or policy designs before they get implemented. So it is, as the name suggests, so it is ex ante simulations. Okay. Since we are processing the data and trying to model the expected effects. Then we can also discuss the other methods like mixed method alongside this impact evaluation, that is combining the quantitative data, right, and the qualitative data. And the purpose of this combination, mixing quantitative data and the qualitative data, is to understand why certain results were not achieved and why certain results were achieved through this policy implementation or program implementation. Okay. Apart from all this method, there are some the other methods or other things that also must be there in addition to the policy evaluation, that is process evaluation. Okay, so what is the focus of this process evaluation? So the focus of the process evaluation is tries to emphasize on the program operations. Okay, program operations, and they also try to see that whether they are consistent with the program's change theory of change. Okay, programs theory of change. So this is again a new term, that is the theory of change is a comprehensive description of how a particular policy or program or an intervention is intended to deliver desired desired outputs, right, and desired results. So through this theory of change we can draw a sequential analysis, right, and trying to explain the causal logic, that means the cause and effect relationship, right, and the specific channels through which a program can influence the consequences or the final outcomes. And it also details why a particular program or a policy, or we can say particular program modality or design innovation is expected to reach its desired objectives. Okay, so that is your process evaluation. So it is consistent with the theory of change. Okay, and the last one that also can be taken into account along with the evaluation policy or impact evaluation is benefit cost analysis or cost effectiveness analysis. So we have already discussed at length about the benefit cost and cost effectiveness. So these are the measures that try to compare the programs or policies impact against their costs to identify or determine which intervention is giving us the highest return on the investment. So these are again the comparative what you can say the measurement, right, or analyzing the program or a policy, okay, to reach at a decision. Okay, so given this understanding, now we can discuss about what are the dimensions of the policy impacts. Okay, so in the policy impacts or policy evaluation, we have to take into account what are the different directions or different aspects of policy impacts, so that the evaluation would be smooth and evaluation would be robust. The first thing that we have to take into account, that policies affect the public issue or problem at which they are directed. Okay, and the people are involved. So for this, since we understand that policies affect a particular problem issue, right, at which they are directed, or for which the policy is meant, and the consequences of the policies are reflected on these particular groups or sections. Okay, so here for policy impacts we need to identify which are the target populations on whom the policy is intended to affect, right. So this must be delineated, right, for policy impacts. And once policy impacts is identified, then policy impact evaluation becomes easy. So when I say that the target population must be defined, right, for a particular policy or program, it means whether the target population for a particular program or intervention are poor, right, or rich, or they are school children, or they are farmers, or they are certain sections of the society. So we have to identify first, and then the intended policy must be determined. So once the target population is identified, the intended policy can be determined. Suppose say if we are taking into consideration the anti poverty program, right, so we can identify what is the purpose of this program, right, whether the purpose is to raise the income of the poor, right, or whether the purpose of this anti poverty program is to increase the employment opportunities. Okay, so the target population and intended policy, right, must be identified. And we know that a particular policy can produce intended consequences and also unintended consequences, and sometimes it can produce both. Okay, so for example, let's say we can take the case of subsidized food grain. Okay, so what is the goal of subsidized food grain? Why at all the policy designed through this subsidized food grain? To address the malnutrition situation of the poor masses, right? But so this, and if the subsidized policy food grain, right, subsidized food grain gets implemented, okay, and as a result it also fulfilled the goal, that is the number of persons who are suffering from malnutrition, so their numbers are also getting decreased. But simultaneously, if you are finding that because of the implementation of the subsidized food grain policy, it can also cause these poor persons not to go for work, right? So this is an unintended policy consequences of this particular policy, that is subsidized food grain, implementation of subsidized food grain. So the intended consequences is decrease in starvation, number of people those who are starving earlier, so their number gets lessened, or you can say there has been a decrease in the number of malnutrition population, right, among the poor masses. But the unintended consequence is that because of this implementation of this policy, these poor people are not ready to go for work. Okay, so this is unintended consequences, because while framing this particular policy, that the likely consequences, this particular likely consequences, we are not thought about. And moreover, so these are some of the dimensions of policy impacts that we are discussing, based on which it would be easier on our task to evaluate the policy impact. So moreover, policies may affect the situation or group other than those at which they are directed. So that is actually called the unintended policy, right? And this unintended policy in this case can be termed as the third party effect, right, or external effect or externalities. Okay, and again these unintended policies can be of two types: positive unintended, right, and negative unintended policy. Okay, or positive third party effect or externalities, and negative third party effect. Okay, and moreover, while discussing about the policy impact, right, so policies produce consequences at different points of time. Okay, so they can affect the futures, and they can also affect the current conditions. So policies can have consequences for future as well as the current conditions. So for example, some policies, right, for some policies most of their benefits or some of their cost may incur at a future time, right. For example, that how the policies, the consequences or benefits or cost of the policies may be produced at a future time. So for example, this preschool education program, so this is a policy, right. So in this preschool education program that is targeted for the poor students, through this it is targeted that the education standards of the poor children would be improving. Okay, so if the children from this particular section, the lower strata of the society, poor sections, so they would be participating, then as a result their short term recognition abilities and their long range development and earning capacity would be increased. Okay, so here this policy has impacts on present as well as for future, right. Earning capacity is can occur at a future time, right, and at present this particular program can benefit the short term cognitive ability. So as soon as students or children got exposed to this preschool education program, so their cognitive abilities got increased. Okay, so this is how we can say that how policy impacts can spread across time as well. And moreover, policies involve costs, right. So perhaps you heard about that nothing is there which we can say as free lunch. Okay, so for everything whatever you want to achieve or we get, we have to pay something, so nothing is free. So that means it incurs cost, right? Everything incur cost. So this cost come in different forms. Sometimes we are finding this cost directly found, that means it is directly observable, which we say it is direct cost, and sometimes these costs are in form of indirect one, so those are indirect costs. Okay, and these public policies can cause the reduced production, higher prices, stress or mental agony, right? So all this we can say that indirect cost. Reduced production is direct cost, okay, higher prices is direct cost. When you are saying that mental agony, so it is through indirect channel, that means because of the lower production, because of the higher prices, the consumers may feel pressurized, right? There is a mental pressure on them. Okay, so we can also take another example, that expenditure to meet, let's say the we need to incur expenditure, higher amount of expenditure to meet some public standards or regulations. So it is, let's say for it is for the coal mine safety requirements. Okay, so expenditure to meet the coal mine safety requirements can cause a reduction in mining output, because there in when we follow the coal mining safety requirements, there are some do's and there are some do nots, right, while undertaking activities for the mining. Okay, so while fulfilling these do's and do nots, right, so in this processes the mining output would be decreased. So if we adhere to the stricter safety rules or safety requirements, so it may cause the reduction in mining output. So now we can find that because of this particular policy, the output is getting down. So this is nothing but a cost. So likewise we can find the other cost, like construction of a barrage, that is direct one, right, or construction of dams or the flood rehabilitations. So all these are involving costs. Okay, so the policies involve costs. So this is what we need to understand before impact evaluation. Okay, so given this understanding on the dimensions of the policy impact evaluation, now we can understand some of the initial or very essential steps that are to be followed for policy impact evaluation. Okay, what are those? So when you say that impact initial steps, that means these are very basic or necessary steps that are ideally taken at the beginning of a particular program's design or policy design phase to build the consensus among different stakeholders involved, and these steps ensure the evaluation remains policy relevant, right? So evaluation should not be policy irrelevant. So what is policy irrelevant? That means the policy is not requiring it, or the data and information produced through evaluation is not meaningful for the policy. Okay, so that means it is policy irrelevant. But the when we say that impact evaluation, here the impact evaluation produces certain data, certain information for the policymakers that would be meaningful to them, right, for furthering the policy decisions. So that remains that is called the policy relevant. So as I told you that we need to follow certain basic steps for this impact evaluation. The first one that we need to take into account is the theory of change, how to construct a theory of a change. When you say that policy, then policies are targeting for a particular problem in the society. Okay, so that means there needs to be a change for improving the particular problem that we are considering. Okay, so this theory of change, as I told you, that it is a description or mapping of the causal logic, right, explained how and why a particular intervention is expected to reach or achieve the intended outcomes. So that is what is called a constructing a theory of change. Okay, sequentially we have to find that if a particular intervention is implemented, then how this intervention is going to achieve the targets. Okay, so this is known as the theory of change, and logically we are proving that through this intervention we are going to achieve this intended outcomes. Okay, so the second step, once we are ready with it, that means we have already understood that how and why a policy or program is going to achieve the intended targets. Okay. The second step that we can take for the policy impact evaluation is developing a results chain. Okay. So a results chain is nothing but a tool that is used to map out the theory of the change by establishing a logical sequence from initial resources till the long term goals. Okay. So given the resources or from the resources till its long term achievements, so everything is mapped. So that is a chain. It is a kind of logical sequence from the initial resources to the long term goals. Okay. So for example, we can think about that how these logical sequences are taken into account. So these logical sequences are taken into account in terms of highlighting the initial resources like inputs, the financial inputs or financial resources, human resources, material resources and other resources that are required for the said policy. Okay. Then we need to take into account what are the expected activities required for the policy implementation. So here we emphasize on the actions that are taken to convert these inputs into outputs. Okay. Then since I told you that inputs activities are the necessary sub steps in order to understand this results. So the once activities are done, it would be transcended into outputs. So outputs are nothing but are in form of tangible goods and services produced or delivered because of the policy implementation. Okay. So followed by outcomes. Outcomes are the use of outputs by the target population or target group and community, and the resulting short term to medium term benefits or changes that is expected, and sometimes some unexpected becomes the outcomes as well. So the last one, the last variable that also needs to be taken into account in this chain, results of chain, is the final outcomes, which is also known as the impact. Okay, which occur in the long term. So this is particularly the ultimate objective or long term goals of the program. So that we need to take into account in this, under this, that results of change. Okay. So once we are done with these two steps, the third steps that is required is specifying evaluation questions. So before evaluating the impact of a policy or a program, we need to develop the questions that through which we can measure that policy. So that means these questions should be very clear. Okay. Or a clear evaluation question tries to focus on the research, and that must be framed in such a way that it can be tested, right? The hypothesis testing is possible, or with the questions should be in terms of testable hypothesis, and these questions should be well defined. Okay. So through these evaluation questions, it tries to ask what, since we are evaluating impact, the question should be valid, well defined. Okay. And this can be tested, right? The testable hypothesis. Okay. So the evaluation questions ask what the causal effect of a program or policy is on the specific outcome that is of interest by the government or a particular authority. Okay. And the second one is also very important for this specific evaluation, is selecting outcome and performance indicators. Okay. So again, for impact evaluation, we have to identify what are the outcomes that we are measuring, okay, and evaluating. And the second one is for measuring what are the indicators that can be taken into account for performances. Okay. So indicators are the measures used to analyze the results, assess the results, and also determine if a program is successful or not. Okay. So these indicators are very carefully constructed, so they must be very specific, they must be measurable, attributable, realistic, and also targeted. Okay. And again, for this, the stakeholders also must agree on anticipated effect sizes, that means the expected magnitude of the change, which are critical for conducting the power calculation of the sample to determine the sample size. Okay. Then the next step is preparing a checklist for data collection. Okay, so once the indicators are selected, fulfilling these attributes, that specific, measurable, attributable, and realistic and target, that is called SMART, right? So fulfilling this criteria, then the practical arrangements must be made to ensure the data can be produced and reliable at on time, right? So for example, we can say that while preparing this checklist for data collection, it involves identifying who is responsible for analysis, who is responsible for determining what should be the resources or what amount of resources are needed, documenting the plans and assessing the risk, expected risk, and also the quality of the data collected. Okay, so given this understanding, now in the next class we will be discussing what are the major concepts that we are using for policy impact analysis, right? So basically we will be discussing the quantitative methods of policy impacts. Okay, and yes, so these are the references that you may further refer. Thank you very much.